There you go, Thomas.
So, good evening, everybody. Welcome at EWM in Vienna. And welcome everybody who is with us via Zoom. I'm very happy to have our guests from Ghent here and from our house. And our topic today, I will briefly introduce the topic first, then our guests in few sentences, and then we'll hear three presentations of the topic from three different points of view. And I would like to mention already now that everybody is invited to take part in the discussion afterwards. You have basically two possibilities how to do it, how to take part. The first one is just raise your hand as usual in any Zoom appointment, and the other is to write a question. We have our moderators, our technical staff here ready to answer both ways to take part in the discussion. So, reverse perspective. Обратная перспектива in Russian. It was a topic which became quite, let's say, explosive in 1919 as Pavel Florensky, a Russian philosopher, published this famous article. It was not the first mentioning of reverse perspective as a principle in art, in representation, in art history and art theory. It was mentioned already before in the German aesthetics and philosophy, starting at the beginning of 20th century. But by Florensky, it became somehow prominent in connection to the avant-garde, to the criticism about the mimetic perspective, well known from the whole tradition of art realism, going back to the art of Renaissance. This system of coordinates which are based in the icon painting, in Middle Age art, became a new relevance in the modernism. And it was only beginning of the big story of reverse perspective in 20th century, because later on it was developed, I think the main period of new interest in reverse perspective in Florensky, in the modernism revisited, was the second half of 60s. The text by Florensky was published in Tartu in Estonia, where the famous school of semiotics took part in 1967. And 3 years later, a book on reverse perspective written by Lev Zhegin was published with the introduction by Boris Uspiensky, a prominent scholar of Tartu School of Semiotics. And it was a new period, of course, where reverse perspective was read by people of that time from different point of view. It was a time of going postmodernism and post-structuralism, revisiting of mimetic and Enlightenment tradition of thinking of questions of representation. And so at that point, I would say the contemporary period of reverse perspective was started, and now we are some 50, 60 years later. And I must say that I am really curious what we will learn tonight about reverse perspective, because we have here three protagonists of this topic, which are going on from the different direction. And now I will introduce briefly all of them. First, Clemena Antonova, who is working in this house. He is an art historian, and in this institute, she is responsible for Eurasia in Global Dialogue. It's a title of the program. She is coordinating here, and she did write a book like 12 years ago on reverse perspective. She's a reverse perspective scholar for a long period of time, and she was also working on an exhibition which is devoted to this topic in the United States. And our discussion tonight is also a product or byproduct of a cooperation between Museum of Russian Icons in the United States and our institute. She will talk about it in her contribution. And Wim Goes, who is sitting like on the left or right side of the screen, I don't know what you see, is architect working in Ghent. Both our guests are working in Ghent, but not only at Ghent. And Wim Goes was working on projects in the Belgian pavilion of the International Architecture Biennale in Venice. One of his many projects. His exhibitions took place also at ETH Zurich and Victoria University in Wellington, where he was invited as a visiting scholar. And he's an architect, so he and Volkmar Mühleis, I will introduce him just in a second. They put together, they published together a book on reverse perspective, and our discussion today, our meeting today, it's also a kind of introduction of this book, or a talk about this book written by Wim and Volkmar recently. So Volkmar is our third protagonist, teaching philosophy and aesthetics. So we have art history, architecture, philosophy and aesthetics in Brussels and Ghent. And his recent publications include a book, I will be honest, I didn't read, so I can quote a title. The title, it's promising, Girl with That Bird. And it's about intercultural observations. It's everything I know about it. But Volkmar is also an author of Philosophische Rundschau magazine, and he's also a musician. So we have a really transmedia group here tonight. My name is Tomáš Glantz. I'm a visiting fellow here in this house. And I'm interested in reverse perspective for all my life, because I read this famous article by Florensky. First, I was, I don't know, 18. It was very explosive topic, and because I'm also interested in Russian avant-garde and post and neo-avant-garde and contemporary Russian art and culture, it is somehow going with me or during all my life. But I don't want to speak about myself, but give a floor first to Volkmar, who will start our discussion. Volkmar, please.
Thank you very much, Tomasz, and hello, everybody. Yes, I will first say something about our book. So I'm coming from philosophy, and therefore I will focus on this aspect, and I prepared a short text, but to give a little bit an introduction on our reverse perspective question, and I just have to see if this works regarding the slideshow. Yes, it seems to work, so perfect. In 2020, Wim Hoos and I published a book called Reverse Perspective. I will just show the book here. This is always okay. No, this is this. This is switching off. You see, it's just like this. So no problem. Otherwise, it comes back. Perfect. And then the next one. Oh, I'm too fast. There's the book. Okay, so technical stuff. So in 2020, Wim Hoos and I published a book called Reverse Perspective. On the one hand, the notion of reverse perspective is not well known in arts and science, so it might have triggered curiosity. On the other hand, the title is a replica of a lecture Thomas just mentioned, and an essay by the same name presented by Pavel Florensky, as the group of people might have noticed who are familiar with his work. Florensky used this term to describe the speciality of Orthodox icons. His lecture dates from 1919-20. What did we do with in our book? We reflected on the history of the idea of reverse perspective by doing an interview with Clemena Antonova to introduce and discuss the notion today. My colleague, the architect Wim Hoos, came about the notion when he visited Orthodox monks in the Sinai Mountains. Together we started several years ago an educational program for students from fine arts and architecture to work practically and theoretically on the contemporary potential of reverse perspective, a joint master program at LUCA School of Arts and the University of Leuven, Faculty of Architecture, situated in Ghent. I will just show some short impressions from our collaboration there, work with the students that we are doing. So we have really this kind of practical approach to it, and I will talk about this in a minute a bit more, so just as some impressions. Let's keep it like this. Let's keep it like this. During our research, we discovered Clemena Antonova as leading scientist in the field and contacted her for our program and later our book. So the book starts with a profound interview. Then Wim is presenting elements of reverse perspective in the context of his practical projects. He will talk about it immediately. Further on, I reflected on reverse perspective from a general philosophical viewpoint. And this is what I would like to concentrate on now, opening the topic also for social and political questions. We have three aspects to differentiate. First, the question of perspective. Second, the figure of reversing. Three, the concept of a reverse perspective, and to which extent it appropriate describes what it stands for. I do not have the time here to analyze deeply all these aspects. Let me allow to address them from my specific philosophical background in phenomenology. And here again, I will use a shortcut. In phenomenology, I lean on the idea of responsivity that Bernard Waldenfels, his books are just standing behind me, I discovered, introduced to it via sources from medicine, Kurt Goldstein, and philosophy, Emmanuel Levinas and others. Phenomenology researches the constitution of mind and experience. To give a concrete example, if I speak out loud, like now, my experience of my voice is not only a question of my own bodily conditions, how to produce sound, but also a question of the space my voice resonates in. My physical body and the experience of it differentiate in space and time. Therefore, phenomenology is not identifying the experiencing body just with a physical one, yet with a reliefo I am orienting in, I relate to, principally indirectly, because the spatial and temporary conditions of my bodily experience go beyond my reach, locally and historically, which implies socially, as a human being. This has consequences for all the three mentioned aspects: perspective, reversing, reverse perspective as a proper term. Edmund Husserl, for example, the founding figure of this phenomenological approach, reminded us as a mathematician that mathematics cannot describe the motivation for mathematics in its own terms by means of quantification and calculation, which again is the basis for geometry, mostly associated in the West since Euclidean geometry with perspective, linear perspective. So, what motivates perspective? Bodily orientation, for example, due to bodily conditions in space and time. Coming back on this gives us a first hint also to reflect reversing. We have two hands, left and right, and they allow many variations of possible connections we might think of. Following Husserl in his studies Ideas 2, regarding a general Reflexion in der Leiblichkeit, reflection in bodily experience, as Waldenfels puts it. In playing with their hands, children explore these variations, left and right as radical opposites, as complementary by folding the hands, as a dialectical connection via the body where we can play changing roles. The one hand is hunting the other like an animal, then the other one becomes the active part, etc. The figure of reversing has this background in experience. The term reverse perspective itself is criticized by Clemena Antonova as a proper description of the phenomenon we face if we look at an orthodox icon, as Florensky and others used it. The term was introduced into art history by the Russian Byzanticist Dmitry Aynalov in 1900 to conceptualize the effect of depth created in these icons. In contrast with linear perspective since Renaissance, orthodox icons are not systemized following one focal point to establish an optical and realistic illusion on a two-dimensional surface or of a canvas or a wall. And I will just also show an example. Okay, this is still from our course, and here are now, for example, as a comparison, on the left you see by Raphael, School of Athens from Renaissance. On the right you see from Bojana Church in Sofia a fresco. They present, orthodox icons, a coherence of divergent perspectives. And I will just zoom in on an example from Bojana Church to make this more visual. Antonova showed that, again, this coherence is not systemized, like the Russian painter and art theoretician Lev Shegin, who was also just mentioned by Thomas, assumed. So, multi-perspectival coherence in icons is not a reversed version of linear perspective. We must go back to the conceptual foundations of both ways of depicting images to discover their motivations. Antonova demonstrates this regarding the theological ideas which motivate orthodox icon painters until today. To which extent can we open the theological and art historical background to gain a critical contemporary view on the possibilities to deal with this heritage of multi-perspectival coherence in a secular way? Might be the question for us here today. The references to answer this question are hidden in history. I have no knowledge of the sources of Aynalov that he might have used in finding the notion reverse perspective for his purpose. I only know that Søren Kierkegaard used the expression reversed perspective in his book on the concept of irony from 1841, as I found in the German edition, where the Danish philosopher is discussing the imagination of Romantic poet Ludwig Tieck talking of a wunderbare Virtuosität in der umgekehrten Perspektive, a wonderful virtuosity in reversed perspective, meaning he could create an atmosphere of uncanny anxiety. The figure of reversing is common since Romanticism. For example, German critic Friedrich Schlegel talked of a historian as einen umgekehrten Propheten, a reversed prophet. The Russian philosopher Leo Shestov assures us in a study on Kierkegaard and existential philosophy, originally published in 1936, that Kierkegaard stayed unknown in Russia up till the 20th century. Romanticism questioned the enlightened aesthetics of Immanuel Kant. Based on the non-interest of the spectator, the figure of reversing is prominent in this later movement, addressing a view on history that stands apart from also the idea of linear dialectic progress, in highlighting indirect effects and symptoms between past, present, and future, and referring to the backside of freedom, like Kierkegaard famously analyzed it, namely existential anxiety, and standing alone, the abyss of the individual. The enlightened subject turned into an existential quest to burden its own life without metaphysical fundaments. It is this existential quest Shestov is suggesting that links the motivations of a Western criticism on the Enlightenment with an Eastern understanding of the conceptual framework of orthodox icons. Kierkegaard is the key in still longing for a theological option. Shestov explains it via geometry. And please allow me to quote the whole passage first in German, then I will give an English explanation. Bis zu einem gewissen Grade kann ein Beispiel aus der elementaren Geometrie uns klar machen oder uns wenigstens näher bringen, wie Kierkegaard den Glauben empfand. In einer zweidimensionalen Ebene ist es ganz unmöglich, in einem Punkt auf einer Geraden mehr als eine Senkrechte zu errichten. Wenn nun irgendeine Linie den Platz der Senkrechten eingenommen hat, so wird für alle übrigen zahllosen Geraden diese privilegierte Linie unzugänglich. Das Gesetz des Widerspruchs, des ausgeschlossenen Dritten und dergleichen mehr bewahren die Privilegierte davor, dass eine der vielen anderen Prätendentinnen in Versuchung kommen könnte, sich mit ihr zu messen. Was aber in einer zweidimensionalen Ebene unmöglich ist, wird plötzlich möglich, wenn wir von der Planimetrie zur Stereometrie übergehen und, uns um eine neue Dimension bereichernd, die Ebene in einen Raum verwandeln. Nun kann man in ein und demselben Punkt einer Geraden eine unendliche Anzahl von Senkrechten errichten. Jegliche Art von Verstehen, von Wissen verläuft in einer Ebene, scheut seinem Wesen nach eine neue Dimension und bemüht sich nach Kräften, die menschlichen ridere, lugere, detestari flach zu drücken, in eine Ebene hineinzupressen. Also das Lachen, Trauern, Verabscheuen, die Emotion bezieht sich hier auf Spinoza. Umgekehrt, reverse, streben diese Letzteren, also das ridere, lugere, detestari, das Lachen, Trauern und Verabscheuen, aus der Ebene hinaus, in die sie das Intelligere, Erkennen hineingezwängt hat, hinaus in die Freiheit. And now I stop my German quote. And to summarize it in English shortly, a planimetric, two-dimensional geometric and logical system, Shestov is telling us, establishing and serving knowledge forms a field where every position is exclusive and cannot be held by another figure, while a spatial, three-dimensional measurement allows a multitude of placings on the same spot from different sides, perspectives. Therefore, the spatial geometry or stereometry allows inclusion and plurality, freedom. Now, this spatial allegory might have three results. First, it accentuates spatiality in depicting as opening a position to plurality, a method as well Orthodox icon painters used as beginning of the 20th century Cubist painters did, or today an artist like David Hockney, for example. There's actually the exhibition now in Vienna. Second, the allegory can be read as an alternative path to knowledge in looking for a religious interpretation, like Shestov did. Or third, the alternative to knowledge can be interpreted in a secular, romantic, existential way too. I do not think that it is by coincidence that Shestov is formulating the alternative via the word umgekehrt, reversed. He articulates the allegory, which echoes in the mindset of Eastern religious thinking, by contrasting the preferred alternative via exactly the word that since Einarlov and Florensky is common to Russian theoreticians in discussing Orthodox icons. As a phenomenologist, and now I'm coming to the end, I am not following the theological option here in an agnostic manner. I see the artistic and architectural potential to depict and create space differently than via Euclidean geometry and linear perspective, and I share the existential quest Kierkegaard was opening. I mentioned my specific phenomenological interest in a responsive approach and the background of motivations in bodily experiences. Via these lines, I would like to address possible social and political consequences now, in the horizon of what is called reverse perspective. Experiencing is a genuine, indirect process, as I mentioned earlier. Affection happens to me, confronts me with passivity, which I try to turn into an active response by longing for this possibility. Waldenfels calls these three phases pathos, passio, and logos. Pathos in the Greek sense of undergoing, suffering, articulated in the grammatical dative of the me, while this me is again to be seen against the backdrop of anonymity, losing itself, alienation, until the disintegration of every possible turn, in a traumatic event, for example, in a state of anesthesia. Then passio, passion, as an in-between zone of passivity and activity, is the meandering of longing, the bodily shaped individual effort to take position, to find yourself capable to answer, until finally your voice appears, searching for the right words, talking about what happened to you, which means entering the sensus communis of shared language and conceptualizations, the logos. In terms of this differentiation, of this pathos, passio, and logos, we are not only becoming persons in a social life thanks to shared habits, codifications, and discourses, as Jürgen Habermas states it, but we are becoming persons by the effort to own ourselves up as social persons, via the communicative possibilities with others, an effort that is carried bodily, individually, psychologically, and which again is provoked, stimulated via the threat of alienation, anonymity. This existential threat is constitutive. Only by taking it into account, responding is carried via a longing that is witnessing its individual motivation, to bring yourself in by using commonly recognized gestures, words, media, tools. That an individual can take initiative is therefore due to three factors: an alienation that provokes owning up, the social world that offers elements to deal with it, and the bodily drive to come up for yourself, to live. It is this initiative that defines acting, also as a political virtue. Shestov described the logos, the sphere of knowledge and rationality, as planimetric, in sharp contrast with the speciality of existence. I could imagine he would feel confirmed by the way we organize knowledge today in digital machines with flat screens. According to Waldenfels, we must differentiate a mere bipolarity like the ones Shestov and Kierkegaard presented by just opposing knowledge and existence, respectively freedom and anxiety. The pragmatic question regarding the attempt of Waldenfels is to which extent the responding to alienation is still motivated by it, witnessing it throughout the phases of pathos, passio, and logos. If social life forms are in the best sense a remedy against individual alienation and losing oneself as a horizon for initiative and acting, what does this mean then for political arrangements? Politics are not limited to arguments and their representatives alone, nor to an enlarged field of a troubled public perception and its rearrangement, if you think of Jacques Rancière's political philosophy. Body and psyche are crucially involved in emotions we recognize as political, if they are shared collectively, like shame, for instance, after violating others during wartime or occupation, to give a drastic example of historical impact. Martha Nussbaum's conceptualization of political emotions comes into play. We all share that individually everyone must own their selves up against the background of alienation. Just if this effort is properly represented in the established social forms that help us to manifest ourselves as active subjects, the level of cognition and recognition, of knowledge and reason is motivating us. Remember what Husserl addressed. Mathematics themselves cannot describe the motivation for it. Or in the words of Shestov, knowledge is planimetric. We are confronted, since the uprise of populism, enforced by the global financial crisis in 2008, and since the current pandemic, with a resentment of people against knowledge presenting itself as autonomous, via experts, that goes so far to block out even reasonable offers and measurements, seeing the tragedies of deadly infections with COVID-19. Being fooled by a greedy capitalism since the 80s, which was even supported by social democratic governments since the 90s. Trust is lacking in Western societies in knowledge for the sake of knowledge, dismantled as not knowledge for the sake of shared wealth anymore. Cognition and recognition work on the social level if they respond to the longing for it, in reaction to alienation, I said before. That they do not work now, that we experience deep frictions in social cohesion, demonstrates the disintegration of pathos, passio, and logos in our societies. It is not about the bipolarity of alienation, existence, laughter, grief, detesting, protesting on the one side, and knowledge, rationality, control, and management on the other. Reverse perspective teaches us that the coherence of multitude and plurality is possible without focusing on either one thing or another. Responsive perspective might mean to understand logos in the layering of motivating passio and distracting pathos. Arguments are not enough if people do not trust them. We should not count these people out. We should understand that arguments are never enough, that they must be motivated in making existential sense. Thank you very much for your attention. So,
thank you so much for this philosophical intervention. I think you repeatedly was using in different contexts the word acting, and I think this performative dimension of reverse perspective is something really fascinating if we would like to understand it also from our contemporary point of view, and maybe, or I hope we'll back to it during the discussion. Wim, please.
Okay. I will speak about 3 projects. I'm a practitioner, I'm an architect. As in the book, I give a kind of description of these projects with affinity to reverse perspective and touching on elements of reverse perspective. There are 3 projects, one commercial project, one public, semi-public place, a clubhouse, and one temporary private house. So I start with the first one. It doesn't switch to the next one. Okay. Yoji Yamamoto Flagship store. Yoji Yamamoto is a Japanese fashion designer, and he came to Belgium with a certain affinity with the Belgian fashion scene. In this building, housing the academy, the renowned Academy of Fashion, the Fashion Institute, and so on, he would take the ground floor. I considered him as a guest in Antwerp. a guest of the citizen, and I wanted to make a place that is also for the citizen, so as open as possible. So I introduced a continuous landscape. As you can see, I added light at the ground floor interior, and because of the V-shaped form, there is a kind of transparency. With this transparency, you blur the edges, you blur the boundaries, and partly the building is dissolved. But of course, how to be in intimacy with the clothes of Yoji Yamamoto? And intimacy is challenge. Richard Sinnett is talking about that, saying that it's pushed back towards the interior, not coping with the challenges of the urban reality. Also, Schimmel is talking about that, talking about the blasé attitude. And in fact, you could say that many impulses are projected and you protect yourself. And so this kind of shielded reality is very much in contrast to this openness towards the work of Yoji Yamamoto. So I needed a kind of gradient, a kind of transition, change of heart. There I introduced sound, acoustic. The sound enters via open doors towards a round space. There it is enhanced. The sound is reflecting to the round space, but from there I added acoustic panels in the ceiling and in the walls, in the backside walls. So sound is coming, entering with you, and the deeper you wander, in the end you're walking with the sound of your footsteps. You entered another world. Drawings. Entering this other world, something else is also happening. The space, if you enter, is not, even if it's open in your direction, you can't measure it. And there is nothing that is supporting this perspectival view. The beams towards the columns could do that, but I painted away with fluorescent light the joint between the beam and the column. There, where there was ornamentation, I put the light. I sent to Yoji Yamamoto, I provide the light, you provide the shadow. Also, David Hockney is talking about shadow, or the lack in shadow in the depiction of images in India, China, Japan. What also happened is that when they said to me, we like white, all the different elements are very difficult to recognize. From the moment you, for instance, recognize the table, it is questioned by the next, and so you still search and project yourself through the space. The clothes of Yoji Yamamoto float in the space. There is a duration in between them. They hang at rails. I hung them at different heights. So when you move through the space, they seem to displace. And it is as if you feel a change in the passing of time. Or like Tarkovsky would touch on it, sculpting time, he called that. And so when you still measure, you shift to another narrative. For instance, hearing. You could hear the spatial, how could I say, the measurements of the space. But of course, with this acoustic installation, the space here like infinitive. The narrative is not supporting a visual picture. So in this continuous landscape, coming from the collective to another world, with the sound as a leading factor, with a certain resistance, there's an engagement towards place and towards the potentiality to come into intimacy with the clothes of Yoji Yamamoto. You need to be there to complete the architecture. Sailing Club Zeebrugge. Sailors came to me for their club in between the marina and the container harbor. I thought it was interesting because they know something. They know how to go from one point to another without energy. I thought it was interesting. Could I make a building like that? So their knowledge would be in there because they know about curved spaces. They read the patterns of the wind on the water, the breaking of the waves, the tides, the pulsar of the stars, the sun and the moon. They navigate. They bring elements in balance. So that's what I wanted to have. These sailors could in fact navigate the building with signs and tools that they recognize, where they can anticipate of what to come. And then I would mix it with publics. So there is an interesting interaction taking place. In the back you can see the trees, lower trees, then higher trees. So the lower one is protecting the higher one. This is in fact the inspiration of the whole building. There is a skin around a core that is non-heated and in fact steered by these sailors with their knowledge. Here with open windows, sometimes protecting from the wind, sometimes transventilation because it becomes too warm. Materials, wood, metal, steel, seashells from Holland, and 300 million year old petrified sea animals from the Jura, crystallized in the floor, in the concrete floor, and sanded. That is the top floor, and as you can see on your right-hand side, there is a little dot. We wanted to mount windmills there, but a politician called me and said this was a bad example for the people. Refugee 2. I'm going to... This is the last project. When the client came to me, he shared with me, I have no problems to die, but I have great problems with friends and family dealing with me in the horizon of disease and death. Spring. The reason he talked to me like this is because he was diagnosed with ALS. ALS is a nervous disease. In the beginning it's difficult to move, to walk, to eat, to speak. And in the end your breath will be taken away. So I had to adapt his house for his last 5 years. Adjacent to his house was a carport, and I used this carport. This could carry it. I studied the 5 stages of the disease. I connected it with technical devices. I layered these plans towards this plan. This is what an architect does. But of course the question is, how do we deal with this first question? Because hope is challenged, and hope could bind people, and there was no hope. The client would not survive. So I thought about another mechanism, ritual. We could build like a ritual with friends and family. During every week we would come together to build collectively, to create a community and solidarity, involvement. We touch the ceiling, the floor, the wall, not to separate, but to connect. We inhabit the place even before it is in use. And this is a mental accessibility, coping with the difficulty of degeneration, illness, and shame. Also, Richard Sennett is touching on that when he connects making with the way how human relations are settled and how to cope with certain difficulties, and creating a situation where through the making uncertain boundaries between people are questions and set. Summer. That's what we did during the summer. With more than 100 volunteers, we built the house. But there were more challenges. How to bring a very diverse bunch of people together. They don't know how to build. So I had to find a kind of key. A kind of key that brought them together. And I thought about youth playing. Everybody played in hayloft, making campsites, or they played at the sea with children they don't know. They built with the sand castles fighting the sea. So this could be the two materials, straw and sand, materials to build with. The farmer came with the straw. We started to build the walls, interior walls, outer walls. We plastered with knives and bare hands. Different generations, the architect, the artist, the cooks, and the professionals. And what we did every week when we came together, we celebrated life with fantastic food and fantastic wine. Fall. This is how it looked like. This is how it looks when it was in use. The inside is arranged or organized with curtains, and the curtains gives a certain flexibility, but also an accessibility and regulating privacy. More and more, when the disease would proceed, the less privacy there would be, till in the end there's only the integrity of the building. The client died in refuge too. Winter. Everything will be taken away. 20% is reusable and recyclable. 80% sand and straw will be scattered over the landscape as fertilizer. This is the art piece my friend artist contributed to Refuge 2. Everybody sees the depiction of honeycomb, a bronze, and you think about it collectively. But the title, Lost Wax, opens, however, another reading. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wim, for this fascinating presentation. I think you did really show us how principles of reverse perspective could work by a singular way, because reverse perspective, it's about subjectivity of viewing and understanding. It's about horizon and reading of horizon, and about how our eyes and our mind, our Vernunft in German, are conceptualizing things, and how objects are addressing our reception, our Wahrnehmung. And I did enjoy these examples, and I think we'll come back to your approaches. Antona, please.
Thank you. Well, I was listening here to Volkmar's talk, where his point of view was a philosophical one, and then Wim was talking about architecture. And in my case, I'm going to go back to painting. And one of the things I thought about was that, you know, buildings are in a way meant to hold us. Icons are objects that we're meant to hold. So the scope with which you're dealing is completely different. But there's also another difference, and it came to my mind last week when I was in Bulgaria, and I walked into a church and I saw an icon which had a sign underneath which said, "Please don't kiss the icon with lipstick." You know, in the Balkans, we love makeup. So that's my question. What makes an image kissable, unlike a building. Why is it that there are certain works of art that invite an attitude which is you touch them, you kiss them, you prostrate yourself in front of them, and so on? And this, I think, is not some sort of abstract question, because this is the thing at the heart of an image that actually makes it an icon. It's not just what you represent in an icon, that you represent the Virgin or Christ or whatever. If you go to the Kunsthistorisches Museum here, the Art History Museum, there are very high quality, beautiful paintings by Caravaggio of Christ, but nobody would describe them as an icon. The icon I saw in Bulgaria was the sort of icon that wouldn't end up in any sort of high-end museum. The quality wasn't very high, but it was certainly an icon. So my question is, what makes an image kissable? What makes an image an icon? And my answer would be that, to some extent at least, it's not just what you represent, it's also how you represent it, and more concretely, how you represent space. So in other words, reverse perspective. In short, I think it's part of my definition of an icon that space is represented in a certain way which follows the logic of reverse perspective. Now, so I want to go very quickly through 3 different connotations or functions of reverse perspective. First of all, as an art historical term, and then I will explain that by showing you some of the icons that I selected for an ongoing exhibition that Tomasz mentioned. So the exhibition is at the Museum of Russian Icons in America, in a place called Clinton, Massachusetts. It's close to Boston. So the exhibition is going on until the beginning of April. And it's basically meant to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the foundation of the museum. So we collected 15 icons from 15 different countries by some of the most important contemporary artists and iconographers. And I'm going to show you some of these images in order to explain what I understand under reverse perspective. And then you tell me if you feel that these are kissable images. And then I'm going to look at a second connotation of reverse perspective, which is the way that this term was used as a philosophical term in Russian religious philosophy at the beginning of the 20th century, in the context of what I call visual thought. Visual thought for me is a way of conceptualizing religious philosophical ideas by using visual categories and art historical categories. For example, perspective is one of the very basic art historical categories that we work with in this discipline. But I think that the way it was used in the Russian context makes it a philosophical term. So what sounds at first glance as an art historical term is used as a way of explaining a philosophical project. And in short, this project was anti-modern and counter-enlightenment. So this is the second connotation that I find interesting. And the third one, which is a third way in which reverse perspective can be used in a contemporary context, is as part of a terminology that can help us towards what is now very, how shall I say, it's a very modern, fashionable thing to do, to decolonize academic disciplines. Now, in order to decolonize art history, you face a great difficulty because unlike philosophy, which has existed for hundreds of years before Western philosophy came about, art history is a Western discipline. So what do you do about that? How do you go about decolonizing it? And I'm just going to suggest a way in which I think that reverse perspective and a lot of ideas and notions around it and the way it was used in Russian scholarship can actually help towards decolonizing art history. And I'm here not speaking just in the abstract. There's actually a project for writing a new textbook of world art. I'm part of it along with many other authors. We're probably close to 30 people. And I'm doing the section on Russian art historiography, and this is in this context that I'm using this term. You know. So let me go to reverse perspective as an art historical term. Can we go, Nikki, can we go to the very first image above this one? Yes. Okay. Now, when you say reverse perspective, you obviously imply that it reverses something. So it is a way of constructing space in icons, in medieval icons, but as you will see, in contemporary icons as well. And the understanding is that it is in some way reversing, turning around something. What does it reverse? Well, Russian authors like Florensky and many others, and then German art historians as well, they say that what it reverses is standard linear perspective. Now, standard linear perspective, as many of you probably know, was invented in the Renaissance, in the 15th century, by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi. In other words, this is, when you say reverse perspective, it's a very misleading term. You cannot reverse something that didn't exist at the time. Icons had been in existence long before the 15th century. And it's not perspective either, and I'll show you why. So what does reverse perspective turn around? Now, usually art historians use as like the favorite example is Leonardo's Last Supper that you can see over here. And now what happens there is that basically all parallel lines, when extended towards the distance, converge, and they're calculated, so artificially calculated, to converge in such a way that they meet into one point in the distance, which is called the vanishing point. So what you see here is the beams from the ceiling, the sides, the walls, the windows, and so on. The parallel lines are calculated in such a way that they actually meet together, they converge in the head of Christ. Now, in other words, in order to have space constructed in such a way, you have to sit down and calculate. You cannot do it just intuitively. You have to have, and there are various ways of doing that. Now, this was the great pride and joy of artists in the Renaissance, because they thought that that put art history, art, at the level of geometry, so it became a science rather than a craft. Now nowadays, nobody actually appreciates art along these lines. So it's not probably a very good argument about it. But what I'm trying to show here is that this is, in a way, a very simple way of constructing pictorial space. Any art student, after 1 or 2 semesters at the academy, can do that. Not paint the Leonardo painting, but construct space like that. So what happens in icons is way more interesting, because space is so much more complicated. And it is so much more complicated because it is non-systematic. Here, you have a systematic space, which means all parts of the painting, all parts of the image follow the same logic. They're subjected to the same principle. Now, what happens in icons is that space in different parts of the image follows a different logic, because you have these different points of view that Volkmar mentioned. And I want to give you several examples from icons from this exhibition from the museum in America, just to show you how much more interesting and how different actually space in icons is. So I don't think it's reverse, it's just completely different, and the logic and the thinking about it is very different. Nikki, sorry, can we move one page down? Okay, so this is one of the icons that I selected for the exhibition. It is by a Bulgarian icon painter and a restorer of icons. Her name is Luba Stefanova, and here this icon is called the Presentation of Mary, the presentation of the Virgin Mary into the temple. Now look at the space here, and you see that it is super, super complex. Now if you look carefully at the objects, the stairs and so on, the podium on which the figure in the center is standing, you will see that basically the only way you can make sense of this space is if you look at various aspects of it from different points of view. So in other words, it is completely different from what you see in a Renaissance painting. A Renaissance painting shows the way you would see a scene from one fixed point of view. In an icon, you move around, you change the perspectives, you see things from different points of view. This is why very often parallel lines, instead of converging, diverge. They diverge because you move around or you change your perspective. So this here is Luba's icon, is one of my really favorite examples of this very highly complex space. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but if you look especially at the building structures, you would see that the logic is completely different from a standard perspective. Can we move to the next one? Now, and there's another icon, which is again one of my favorites from this exhibition. It's by a Serbian academic and artist, Todor Mitrovic. He actually wrote quite an important book on icons, which was translated into several languages. And this is, obviously, you can see the scene here. This is the Last Supper. Now, it's not very clear, but you can see in white letters there, it says Tajna Večerja in Serbian. So in the Slavic languages, the Last Supper is the secret supper or the mysterious supper. Now, I think that in a way it is interesting to see how when you mention to most people the Last Supper, the image that comes to your mind is Leonardo's fresco. We're so much used to thinking about art through Renaissance art. Here you have an iconographical type which is very typical of Eastern Orthodox and Byzantine art. So this sort of eccentric arrangement is actually very canonical. Christ is on one side and you have this strange arrangement and all that. But again, the main reason I'm showing you that is that if you look at this image, again, in order to make sense of the space, you have to use different perspectives. Look, for example, at the objects you have on the table. So the table itself is shown from not completely above, but a high point of view. So the angle of vision is quite wide. And then you have objects on the table that are shown from the side. So a much more narrow angle of vision. But then with some of them, for example, the chalice in front of Christ, it's quite a complicated actually synthesis of perspectives because it is shown from the side, but then part of it is shown from above as well. So this is something very typical of icons. And can we move to my last image? Now, this is quite an interesting icon. First of all, if you see from the texture, this is not paint. It's actually semi-precious stones. And it is an icon that was produced at the St. Elizabeth Convent and Workshop. They have a big and very important workshop where the icons actually produced by the nuns in the convent. So this is in Minsk in Belarus. The reason I'm showing you that is, again, you see this sort of complicated space, but the main reason I'm showing you this image is that you obviously have two moments of time. Think again how in a Renaissance painting you can only show a scene at one moment of time. Like Leonardo's Last Supper. What you see here is Saint John the Baptist, who has turned to Jesus, and at the same time you see Saint John the Baptist's head on a plate. So in other words, you obviously have at least two moments of time. This is very typical of pre-Renaissance, medieval, classical, antique art. And again, the logic is completely different from what happens in the Renaissance. So this is about reverse perspective as an art historical concept. Now, I want to also tell you just a few sentences about why I think it is important. Do I have 2 or 3 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So, the way that reverse perspective was used in philosophy. You know, for me, it was very interesting to notice when I started working on this topic in the context of my PhD, that the most interesting writing on reverse perspective came not from art historians, it came from philosophers. So I asked myself why. And I think that it wasn't because these were people who had an eccentric peripheral interest in the history of art. I think that these were philosophers who used reverse perspective as a way of conceptualizing their philosophical project. So in this sense, this for me is an example of visual thought. So the reason, like Pavel Florensky was mentioned several times here, he was one of the most prominent and influential religious philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century. He became part of a movement in Russian philosophy that aimed on the one hand to critique, actually even to dismantle the mainstream of Western philosophy, and that for them meant mainly Kant, because their thinking was that there was a crisis of Western philosophy which had led to the crisis of modernity. The way to get out of that is to come up with an alternative philosophical theory. So this is why, for Florensky perspective, which as you see involves ideas of space, ideas of time, became quite a useful philosophical tool, because his whole critique centered around a criticism of linear Renaissance perspective that showed things only from one point of view rather than in their entirety, and so on and so forth. And he put up the model of reverse perspective as much truer to the way that actually we experience the world. I don't want to go into details. The point is that for Florensky, reverse perspective was a philosophical concept which was part of a project which was meant to critique Western philosophy and come up with an alternative Russian philosophical project in its place. So this is the philosophical side of it. And now I want to finish with something else, which is one of my very recent interests. Now, you know that when you think about all these decolonizing projects, of course, the thinking is that why do we only study the classics of Western literature? What about, you know, literature coming from other parts of the world? There's so much of it. There's such a rich tradition of literature coming from different parts of the world. The same applies to philosophy. Now, art history is a very specific case because art history is a very modern discipline that comes out of Enlightenment, 18th century philosophy. And in this sense, it is a bit more difficult to come up with a radical way of decolonizing the discipline. When I say a radical way, what I mean is that what has been done quite a lot in the last decade or so is that you open art history to non-Western traditions. So in a typical survey of global art, you will have not just the Italian Renaissance and Western art, but you include quite a lot about Indian art and Chinese art and the art of Oceania and so on. But this for me is not a really interesting radical way of decolonizing the discipline, because you're still using terms and concepts that are completely Western, and they were created in order to describe classical Greek and Roman art and Renaissance art. So you use visual material that comes, let's say, from China, but you describe all these works of art by using words and terms that are Western and that don't belong there. And at the same time, it is difficult because the whole conceptual vocabulary of art history is Western. And so now there's this project of a textbook. The editors are an art historian from Chicago, James Elkins, and someone from Oxford, Jas Elsner. So they came up with this idea of doing a new textbook where the whole terminology is completely new. So when you describe icons, you use terms that come out of this tradition. And I think that this is where reverse perspective can be used. And interestingly, with people like Florensky and so on, this goes along with the idea of reverse time in icons and so on. So there's a lot of terminology that plays around the idea of reversal. And what is being reversed is actually Western concepts and ideas. So this is it. I don't want to take more of your time, because for me, always the most interesting part of all these, presentations and lectures is, if people actually have questions. So I hope that there'll be some questions and comments. Thank you.
For introducing your research, your exhibition, and your not only present but future ideas about using this concept. And I have at least one question, but I will not begin with this question now, because maybe we have some questions or remarks or comments from the audience. Do we have something like comments, questions, remarks, etc.? Not yet? Yes, please.
Following your point that the term reverse perspective is in a way inaccurate, because what we call reverse perspective existed before perspective. Quite obviously, Western way of thinking. What would be a more adequate term? You said that this is a multi-perspective.
I think...
You were to invent a term which is not a slave of the bad term of the past.
Yes. Well, what I do in my own work is that I just keep using reverse perspective in inverted commas, but that's not a good way of going about it. I think that, for example, one possibility is that Florensky, this Russian philosopher we mentioned several times, he mentions a term which is called supplementary planes. And now this sounds, to art historians, this immediately sounds very similar to what's going on in Cubist art. Now in Cubist art, as you know, you have a portrait of someone and you have profile and frontal views put together. Now, this is not very different from what happens in icons, that you show an object from different points of view and you synthesize these objects on the same picture plane. So I think that supplementary planes, which means in a way additional planes, additional to what you see from one point of view, you show the sides, you show the top, you show the bottom and so on. I think this is one possibility too. But, I'm still thinking about it. I think that, it is difficult because you come up with a term, but then people don't connect it to anything. But I agree that I think you need a radically different terminology, and I just want to finish with that, there was recently something called a Dictionary of Untranslatables that was published by, I think, Princeton. And I think they have this great idea that I'm in great support of, that when you talk about radically different traditions, where the words and the terms are untranslatable in your own language, it actually makes sense to keep them in the original. You sort of spell them with Latin letters, but now of course you can't do that with too many terms. But I think that there's certain terms that you can keep in the original language. Like for example, in this textbook we're now working on, they're keeping Japanese terms, Chinese terms in Latin letters, but the way they're in Chinese or Japanese, because they're untranslatables. Yeah.
Thank you for this really multifaceted talks, and it's an exciting topic for me. But I was puzzled by your question, Clemena, about the kissability of the icons and your hypothesis. Do you hypothesize that there is a link between what is misleadingly called reverse perspective and the kissability? And I would venture a hypothesis, if you allow me, and then I will refute it, because the hypothesis that struck me initially was that actually it is because you have different perspectives on the icon and that you relate closer and you feel much closer to the object in the icon, and then you feel disposed to kiss it. But on the other hand, if you observe closely what people do when they kiss an icon, it's usually that they kiss the Madonna. So it is one perspective only. It is not that many perspectives. So I was wondering, what do you make? I mean, what is your explanation first of the kissability of the icon? Does it have anything to do with these multiple perspectives? And if not, if it is the case that actually it's always the icon from Bulgaria that you showed, the one from the artist, it's not a kissable icon. Okay. Usually the kissable icons are with the Madonna or with the Trinity, and you have a particular object that people kiss, not different planes, different stages of the development of the story. It is the child or the mother.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just one.
Okay, I can tell you what is my own personal interpretation to that, and I'm sure that other people have other interpretations. So my own personal interpretation is that when you show an object from different points of view, so Florensky supplementary planes, that imitates a type of vision which is not the vision we have, it is the vision that God would have. God is beyond time and space. So by definition, in theology, there are various theologians, John of Damascus, how does the divine eye see? Well, if you have a being who is beyond time and space, he sees an object from all possible sides, all together simultaneously at the same time. Now, in an icon, an object is not represented from all possible sides because it would look so distorted, nobody would recognize what it is. But the fact is, it is represented from various sides. And I think that this is a way of imitating divine vision. Now, if you do that, it means that in an icon, you have a space which looks fundamentally different from our space. So it looks like transcendent space or something like that. And this is what makes it kissable. Now, I agree with you. It's not just kissable. It's an icon that you pray to, you prostrate yourself to. Think about War and Peace, Tolstoy's novel, the day before the Battle of Borodino. There's the icon procession, and everyone, the soldiers and the officers and General Kutuzov, go on their knees and they kiss the icon. And yes, as you say, it's an icon of the Smolensk Mother of God. So it is important who you represent and what you represent. And I think, yes, people usually wouldn't kiss the stairs going inside a temple. But at the same time, you have so many paintings high quality, beautiful paintings of the Virgin and Child and of Christ, and people wouldn't dream of kissing them or praying before them and so on. And I think that what makes icons icons is the way that space is manipulated, and it is manipulated in a way to make it look like transcendent space, beyond our senses, or divine space, or whatever word you want to use.
But then why would you kiss a transcendent space? It is so distant.
Well, you don't kiss the space, you kiss the figure. You kiss the figure in the space, you know. But yes, by the way, I think that this thing with the figure is, for me, a very interesting thing, because can you pray to an icon that doesn't show a figure? Malevich's black square, what is that? Is it an icon or it's not? In a way, it was put in the corner, in the place where Russians put icons. On the other hand, can you pray to something that doesn't show anyone or anything? It's just completely abstract. There is no shape, no form, nothing there. So can you pray to it? This is a question. I don't have an answer to that. I'm just saying that your question just made me think about it.
Short intervention. Your last question. This is the essence of Judaism.
Sorry?
The empty space in the Temple of Jerusalem.
Yes.
They can't hear you on Zoom.
Yeah.
My answer was, can you pray to an empty something? That was the empty space in the Temple of Jerusalem. This is the essence of Judaism.
Yes, yes. But, you know, I think that probably when it comes to icons, you know, there's a major difference between Judaism and Christianity. Christ did become visible. Therefore, the icon of Christ, you can make an argument that on the one hand, God is spirit, you cannot represent God, but Christ did become visible, so you can represent Christ. Now that you don't have that in Judaism or Islam. So I think the logic is a bit different, but it's an interesting question. Yeah.
So our time is almost expired, and I have one question for all three of you.
Okay.
And it's if you, Clemena, invited me to take part in this discussion, I was fascinated by the term politics in the title, which automatically was not connected for me with my understanding of reverse perspective. And now we did speak, or you did speak a lot about conventions of space representation, about conventions of space construction, about conventions or strategies of dealing with works of art, with horizon, with distance, with involvement, about, I would say, performative gesture in dealing with work of art or with space. It was about the question, who is acting? And it's, I think, a question which is important for any dealing with reverse perspective. Who is dealing? Is God dealing, or acting, or the painter, or the physical space, or the viewer? And all this complex of questions was titled with the theme of politics, and you already did some answers on this question from the title, but I think it would be fair also to our audience if you would be so kind and try like shortly to condense this politics of reverse perspective, because your perspectives are also very different. We did learn it tonight. It was a philosophical perspective, and a perspective of an architect, and a perspective of art historian. And how would you condense this political approach and political moment in this maybe eternal question, because Malevich is leading us to the future. It's the icon, the black square is the icon of future. So maybe in future we can answer the kissability of black square, and we have the whole history of art, and we have the present decolonization consideration about politics of perspective. Please.
I don't know. Yeah. There were certain things that I thought was really interesting because, and I do not want to start again with the kissability, but the idea of a certain nearness, the fact that this icon should not be in front of you. It's not needed because it's not perspectival. You can hang it here, meaning that you can move towards it, so you can go nearby, and this is what a normal artwork doesn't do. It keeps you positioned, crystallized on one place with a certain distance, because there you have this only vision. So in fact, this is, to me, also in architecture, something important, but also in politics. By communication or communicating towards a certain group, you keep this group frozen. They should understand, if you understand. There is no space for interpretation. There is no space to deal with something. And when they do not understand, they are not part of it anymore. So to me, that is the thing, what is interesting in the icon. It creates a kind of openness towards different publics and with different history. And it is not so hermetic, in fact, or than what perspective does. So that is, to me, the possibility that reverse perspective gives, and I think it's, in these times, it's an extremely important issue.
Thank you.
I would also say, I mean, we experience so many hardened discussions on so many levels since populism, pandemic, and so on and so on. And there you get this kind of confrontation between, let's say, for example, the good argument and the resentment against. Actually, let's say, I mean, if, let's say, reverse perspective reminds us of a possible coherence of a multitude of divergent perspectives. So what kind of space can this be already for discussion, for example, etc.? And I mean, if for sure, I mean, if let's say knowledge turns its back or just focusing on itself, it forgets its motivation in a certain way. And this, I think, is with Waldenfels, I thought this how can you layer the things more complex, let's say? How can you avoid this kind of confrontation that actually is a heritage since, Romanticism against Enlightenment in a certain way. So if the one is just turning the back to the other, you end up in this kind of confrontation. But if you're opening towards each other, actually you recognize that, let's say, the knowledge needs a motivation, and on the other hand, let's say for sure, also this kind of criticism also needs the side of the knowledge. So in this sense, how can you layer this much more to again create space for also the complexity that we are facing? Because we realize, I mean, in the end, you also have to live together, to convince people to answer. So it's always demands much more than, let's say, the better argument.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Clemena, would you like to have a last word?
This sort of idea of the politics of space is something that I learned from Volkmar. When he came to Sofia and we had a discussion there, which then went into the book, it had never crossed my mind that this topic can be approached from these two points of view. First of all, as a way of being used in actual architectural practice. I had never thought about that. And the way that Volkmar actually showed how he approached it, from the point of view of contemporary politics. At the time we were talking about multiculturalism, being able to take, you know, the side of the other and understand things and see things. This is why, you know, when you talk about, let's say, multiculturalism, you constantly use these visual terms to see the world, to see things from the point of view of someone else. In a way, this is what reverse perspective visualizes, you know.
Thank you. I would say I would like to recommend to everybody to read this book. We spoke about it not so much, but it's not a big book in a volume and number of pages, but it's and I don't know how it is kissable, but it's very good readable and maybe kissable as well. Anyway, I would say it is not. It's not cliché if I will say that we did learn a lot tonight. So I did learn a lot, and I'm very grateful to three of you that you made it possible and made it true to learn about reverse perspective, something we can take with us to our future readings, kissing, viewing, thinking, and thank you who have been with us tonight, and see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas, to you as well. And, thank you. And thanks to everyone who came and to everyone who was listening and showed interest. Thank you.